In this beginner video about how to solder and desolder, we're going to be using a normal soldering iron, the cheap inexpensive one which does not incorporate temperature regulation, a hot test station which also incorporates the soldering iron and temperature regulation, then a fume extractor so that the fumes from the soldering are exhausted somewhere else rather than us inhaling them into our lungs. Then I'm going to be wearing some gloves so that I don't burn my hands, which normally happens sometimes. Here I have a dead computer power supply casing that I'm using to be the stand of this soldering iron, and a wet towel so that I clean the tip of the soldering iron. Then the hot test station and soldering iron already comes with its own stand and the holder for the hot air gun. So I'm not going to be needing any additional stands for that one. And it also has a sponge so that I can clean the tip of the soldering iron. I've turned on the fume extractor. Let me just show you the function of the fume extractor. It sucks all the fumes that are produced during the soldering. Okay, so before you start any soldering, there's some preparation work you have to do, like tinning the tip of the soldering iron. This is done so as to increase the lifespan of the tip, because if you don't tin it, it's going to be corroded away. So if you tin it so that you give it an extra protective layer of solder on top of it. Let me just demonstrate how that is done. You take a solder wire, then your soldering iron, then you just run the solder wire on top of the tip, so that it's sort of like covers or bubbles on top of it. Then when it's done, you just clean it off and you get like a shiny finish on it. This is the layer of the solder that is been put on top of the tip. Let me just do it again for the soldering iron from the water station. Then I use the sponge to clean it. Okay, so here I have two pieces of wire which I want to join using soldering. So there are various ways you can do this. First of all, maybe you may try to tie them up without any solder, or you can just tin each of the wires, then solder them together, which is what I'm going to be doing since it involves more soldering and there's much more skill to be gained from doing that approach. So first of all, what you need to do, you have to grab your wire like I did here. Then you have a soldering wire. Then normally there are what are called the helping hands which are used, but in this case, since this is a beginner video, you normally don't have those helping hands. So I'm going to be using these pliers to hold my wire. Then I'm going to take my soldering iron. Then I'm going to place it directly on the wire. Then I'm going to let the solder flow. So as you can see, the solder is flowing on the wire. Let me do it again on the other wire, the second wire which we're going to be using. Let me bring it into focus. Now this is the second wire which we're going to be using. As you can see, it's still loose, does not have any solder on it. So the process is the same. I'm going to hook it up to this helping hand. Then like we did earlier, I'm going to put my soldering iron on the tip of the wire. Then the soldering wire is going to come next. Then when a sufficient amount of soldering wire has been deposited on the joint, you remove the soldering wire. Then like previously, you run your soldering tip until you are convinced that it has flown. The solder wire has flown like this. Then after this, it's now time for joining the two. Okay, since I don't have the helping hands, I'm going to be using the holes on this casing. I'm going to put two of my wires through the holes. So what this soldering iron is going to do is it's going to melt the solder wire that has been placed there previously. And when it melts, it's going to melt on both the wires and it's going to flow between the two wires. And when it flows, we're going to form a joint. Now the challenge here is we don't have helping hands. So during the process, maybe you may run out of solder, but some of the solder is going to drop down. You may actually want to put additional solder. However, in this case, we have successfully joined the two wires using this method. As you can see, we have a joint there and it's really strong, as you can see. So now we are going to be desoldering the joint. So as you have noticed earlier, by just putting the tip of the soldering iron on the joint, the solder is going to melt. And when the solder melts, we can just pull away the two wires and they'll be free. But however, in this case, I just want to demonstrate the use of the hot air gun. And as you can hear, it's now on. I'm just going to put it close to the joint, and by sheer gravity it's going to fall off. I hope so. The temperature is at around 350. So some of the possible things you need to take note of is your duration at which you place your soldering iron on the joint when you're soldering these wires, because a prolonged time will lead to the wires burning up, and usually that is not good because you're going to remove some of the insulator on the wire, so it's not advisable. Okay, at around 350 it's not going well as I had assumed. So this brings us to another issue. We have what is called solder flux. Solder flux is a type of material that you deposit on where you have solder. It actually helps in the melting process, sort of like catalyzes. It lowers the melting point of the solder. Apparently that is not for the beginner video which we are doing today. I'm just going to ramp up the heat and do this again. Okay, so this is our soldering iron. Let me just ramp up the heat to 450. Okay, then I'm going to increase the volume of air it releases up to 7.5 there. But be careful whenever you do this, because you may actually burn some of the components or even burn yourself. Okay, now we are at 450. Can the joint survive? A summary of today's video. You take a soldering iron, you place it on the joint, you take a soldering wire, you run it, and it flows inside the wire. Then when it's flowed throughout the wire, you are sure that you have made a solid contact. Then when it comes to joining, you take another piece of wire, you put it closer, you take your soldering iron, you run it across them. So now as you're running them across, the solder on the two wires is going to melt, flowing between the wires, interconnecting the two wires. Then you remove your tip of your soldering iron, the solder cools down. When it cools down, it hardens. Then you have two wires that are joined together.